We have established that the galaxy functions as a containment structure. We have cataloged the eldritch entities, the rot, the hunger, the bedlam spirits that press against the barriers of reality. But containment requires more than architecture, requires enforcement, and for 25,000 years that enforcement has been entrusted to an institution that claims absolute moral clarity, the Jedi Order. They position themselves as guardians of peace, wielders of the light, incorruptible arbiters of justice. But there exists a darker pattern in the archives, one that suggests the Jedi's greatest strength is also their fundamental liability. Their connection to the Force grants them prophetic insight, metaphysical authority, and unshakable conviction in their own righteousness. And that certainty, that inability to doubt their own moral framework, has transformed them into something more dangerous than the threats they claim to fight. What we're examining today is not whether the Jedi are villains, but whether they are architects. Architects of every catastrophe they claim to prevent. Architects, ultimately, of their own extinction. This is not a comprehensive history of the Jedi Order. Across 25,000 years, they prevented countless disasters we'll never know about, precisely because they were prevented. But patterns of institutional failure reveal how organizations construct their own nemesis, from the radicalization of Sith survivors to the creation of General Grievous, from the destabilization of Terrace to the clones that would execute Order 66. Every threat that eventually destroyed the Jedi can be traced back to a moment when the Order's absolute certainty prevented them from seeing they were wrong. Welcome back to the archives. This is Compendium Queries. Today we examine the tyranny of certainty and how the Jedi became the architects of their own extinction. The theology of abandonment. To understand how certainty becomes tyranny, we begin with the Pius Dea Crusades. For nearly 1,000 years, the Galactic Republic operated under a human supremacist, theocratic regime that prosecuted systematic extermination campaigns against non-human populations. The scale of destruction fundamentally altered the Outer Rim for millennia, and the Jedi Order, faced with a choice between intervention and ideological purity, made a decision that reveals the first architectural principle of their eventual collapse. When doctrine conflicts with necessity, doctrine wins. The Contespex dynasty prosecuted 34 distinct campaigns, not defensive operations, but programs of cultural erasure. Entire species were deleted from the galactic record. And where were the Jedi? Where were the Guardians sworn to defend the helpless? In 11933 BBY, the Jedi High Council formalized the recusal. Their reasoning was philosophically coherent within their own framework. War produces emotional escalation. Emotion leads to the dark side. Therefore, intervention would corrupt them. They were certain, absolutely certain, that preserving their spiritual integrity was more important than stopping genocide. This is the tyranny of certainty at work, a moral calculus so internally consistent that it becomes blind to external suffering. The consequences were not abstract. This abandonment forged the permanent resentment the Outer Rim holds towards the core, a political wound that would fester for millennia. When the separatist crisis erupted thousands of years later, it wasn't a new conflict. It was the bill coming due for Pius Dea. The Jedi's certainty that they needed to remain pure constructed the fault lines that would eventually tear the Republic apart. First, architectural principle. Ideological rigidity doesn't prevent catastrophe, it delays and amplifies it. And the vacuum created by their withdrawal produced something worse. A splinter faction calling themselves the Order of the Terrible Glare, integrated with the Pius Dea apparatus, becoming enforcers of the genocide. They twisted the Force to serve theocratic ideology. The Council's neutrality didn't just fail to prevent this schism, it created the conditions where Force users could justify atrocity through institutional silence. When the Order finally re-emerged after Pius Dea collapsed, they scrubbed this history from their archives. They were so certain it was an aberration that they never examined whether their withdrawal had caused it. Because they never learned the lesson, they would repeat the pattern again and again. The Zealotry of the Light. If Pius Dea demonstrates the tyranny of certainty through inaction, the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War demonstrates it through zealotry. The Republic had defeated Nagasado's invasion. Threat neutralized, but Supreme Chancellor Bultimo, with Jedi support, authorized a counter-invasion of Sith space. Not to occupy, not to pacify, to eliminate. The historical record here is contested, so precision matters. What's documented? Republic forces conducted extensive operations with the explicit goal of preventing future Sith threats. What's debated? Whether this targeted the Sith Empire as a political entity or the Sith purebloods as a species. What's undeniable? The Jedi participated in offensive military action based on a metaphysical premise that Sith purebloods were inherently irredeemable, genetically predisposed to darkness. The Jedi Code states, a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. But they were certain, absolutely certain, that preemptive elimination of a dark side threat constituted defense. This is how certainty warps moral reasoning. They couldn't distinguish between the Sith Lords who launched the invasion and the civilians living under their rule because their doctrine told them the distinction didn't matter. The light side had decreed the Sith irredeemable, and the light side could not be wrong. The consequences? They manufactured their own nemesis. The surviving Sith population fled into the unknown regions carrying a narrative of persecution. Whether that narrative was entirely accurate is irrelevant. It became operationally real. Vitiate leveraged this trauma to rebuild an empire on Dromund Caste constructed entirely around retribution. When they returned a millennium later to sack Coruscant, they were executing a revenge plot the Jedi themselves had written. Vitiate may have already been a monster, but the Jedi gave him an army of radicalized believers and a cause that justified any atrocity. Second architectural principle. When you're certain your enemy is irredeemable, you guarantee they become exactly that. The paranoia of prophecy. The Jedi Code warns, fear is the path to the dark side. But what happens when institutional fear masquerades as prophetic certainty? The Jedi Covenant, formed before the Mandalorian Wars, believed they had discovered a method to prevent Sith resurgence before it began. They were seers, guardians of the timeline itself. On Terrace, the Covenant's leadership experienced a shared Force vision, a figure in a red environmental suit destroying the Order. They interpreted this as actionable intelligence. One of their Padawans was the threat. They were certain, so certain they staked 5 lives upon it. They executed their own students. Preemptive murder rationalized as prophylactic defense. This is the endpoint of the tyranny of certainty. When you believe you can predict evil, you justify committing evil in the present to prevent hypothetical evil in the future. The master-apprentice bond, the foundation of Jedi continuity, was weaponized because the Watch Circle could not imagine their vision was wrong. They were wrong. Zane Carrick escaped, and he was innocent. The real threat? Hazen, a fallen Jedi in their own ranks, went undetected because they were too busy staring at their prophecy. By murdering their own students, the Covenant destabilized Terrace, creating the chaos that made it vulnerable to the Mandalorian invasion that would level the planet. They didn't prevent the catastrophe they foresaw. They authored it. Third architectural principle. Certainty in your ability to predict the future blinds you to the damage you're causing in the present. The bureaucracy of evil. Not all Jedi failures stem from mysticism. Some emerge from something more banal, bureaucratic certainty. The Huck War, a conflict between the Kaleesh and Yamri, should have been straightforward. The Yamri conducted enslavement operations. The Kaleesh resisted. But the Yamri had Senate connections. Led by Kaiman Jai Shalal, the Kaleesh drove the slavers off their world and launched a counteroffensive. The Yamri, facing defeat, reframed the narrative. They painted the Kaleesh as aggressors. The Senate, influenced by corporate interests, accepted this version. And when the Jedi were dispatched to enforce the Senate's judgment, They didn't investigate. They didn't question. They were certain the Senate's intelligence was reliable. There's no evidence the Jedi used Force perception to verify who was actually suffering. They functioned as enforcement, not guardians. They sided with the enslavers, compelled Kalee's surrender, and imposed a blockade that resulted in mass starvation. Kaimanjai Shilal watched his family starve while Jedi ships prevented aid from reaching the surface. He sold his body to pay his people's debts. He became General Grievous. Every Jedi he killed during the Clone Wars, every lightsaber he collected, was a receipt for this moment. The Jedi were so certain of the Senate's authority that they never questioned whether they were enforcing justice or corporate interests. They built their own executioner because their certainty made investigation unnecessary. Fourth architectural principle: when you're certain your institutional authority is legitimate, you become a weapon for whoever controls that institution. The pattern repeated at Galidraan. A corrupt governor told the Jedi that Jango Fett's true Mandalorians were slaughtering civilians. The Jedi arrived, certain of their intelligence, and demanded surrender. When Fett refused because he was innocent, they massacred his entire unit. They functioned as assassins and never knew it. This is why Jango agreed to be the clone template. This is why he knew those clones would eventually be weaponized against the Jedi. The genetic army that executed Order 66 traces its origins to this snow-covered killing field. The Jedi's certainty that they were enforcing justice made them the architects of their own firing squad, the hubris of the Golden Age. The High Republic era, the so-called Golden Age, represents the apex of Jedi's certainty. They operated at maximum institutional power and cultural prestige. They built Starlight Beacon not as a strategic asset, but as a declaration. That concentrated light-side presence could deter darkness itself. They were certain that their mere existence made them invincible. They systematically underestimated the Nihil, dismissing them as pirates beneath serious concern. More critically, they operated under the certainty that threats to Force users would follow known patterns: Sith ideology, corruption, individual fallen Jedi. They could not conceive of something fundamentally outside their framework. The Nameless, creatures that feed on Force connections, represented a category of threat their philosophy had never accounted for. When Martian Row weaponized their symbol of hope and turned it into an instrument of mass destruction, the Council's response was retreat. The Guardian protocols, abandoning the Outer Rim to the Occlusion Zone, had millions left behind an impenetrable barrier. The Jedi were so certain that their presence was essential that when reality contradicted that certainty, they withdrew rather than adapt. Fifth architectural principle: when your institution is built on the certainty of its own indispensability, failure becomes existential, and the only response is abandonment. The architects of their own extinction. So what does this pattern reveal? The Jedi Order didn't fall to external threats. Every catastrophe that eventually destroyed them can be traced to a moment where their absolute certainty prevented self-correction. The Separatist crisis, rooted in Pius Dea abandonment. The Sith Empire's return, fueled by the hyperspace war's brutality. General Grievous, created at Kalee. The Clone Army, born at Galidraan. Even Anakin's fall stems to the Order's certainty that emotional attachment is weakness, that love is a path to darkness, that their framework for understanding the Force is the only valid one. This is the tyranny of certainty. The dark side corrupts through temptation, power, revenge, domination. But the light side? The light side corrupts through conviction, through the unshakable belief that you are right, that your framework is infallible, that doubt itself is a form of weakness. The Jedi's greatest strength, their connection to the Force, their moral clarity, their institutional cohesion, became their greatest liability because it made them incapable of recognizing when they were wrong. They didn't fall because they were weak, they failed because they were architects. Every act of certainty, every moment they chose doctrine over investigation, prophecy over humility, institutional authority over individual suffering. laid another brick in the structure of their own extinction. They built General Grievous. They built the clone army. They built Vitiate's empire. They built the resentment that fueled the separatists. Brick by brick, failure by failure, century by century, they constructed the exact mechanisms that would destroy them. Order 66 was not a betrayal. It was an architectural collapse, and the Jedi spent 25,000 years building it.